Coffee pooling on a $5,000 Persian rug doesn't look like an accident. It looks like a death sentence. Simone held the cracked porcelain, her knuckles ashy and tense, waiting for a bullet. Instead, the most ruthless boss in the syndicate knelt down and handed her a damp cloth. Fluorescent lights buzzed, a low, irritating hum that dug into the base of Simone's skull. She dragged a damp microfiber cloth across the sprawling expanse of a black mahogany credenza. The penthouse always smelled wrong. It smelled of imported cedar, expensive ozone purifiers, and the faint, coppery tang of old violence that industrial bleach could never quite mask. She hated the smell. It clung to her dark skin, settled into the cheap polyester of her uniform, and followed her onto the subway ride home. Outside the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city wept a steady, grey drizzle. The sound of traffic 40 stories down was nothing but a muted ocean roar, kept at bay by triple-paned bulletproof glass. Inside, the temperature was a perfectly regulated 72 degrees. It was a sterile, isolated fortress. Simone despised it. Every reflective surface, every piece of brushed steel and polished marble felt like a mockery of her cramped, damp apartment, where the radiator clanked all night. Leo sat by the window. He was a silhouette against the skyline, perfectly still. He was the undisputed head of the local Korean syndicate, a fact Simone only knew because her previous employer had vanished over a dispute involving Leo's gambling fronts. Leo's face, sharp and impossibly unreadable, was currently buried in a leather-bound ledger. He operated entirely under an anglicized name, a calculated move to assimilate and conquer the western seaboard's underworld. To his enemies, he was a ghost. To his men, he was a god. To Simone, he was the guy who paid $600 a week in crisp, untraceable bills. She didn't care about his empire. She cared about rent. She cared about her brother's medical debts, a mountain of paper that threatened to bury her alive. Simone moved to the glass coffee table. She reached for an empty tumbler. Her hip caught the edge of a heavy, crystal ashtray. It didn't shatter. It just hit the hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud, scattering grey ash and a half-smoked cigar over the toe of Leo's polished Oxfords. The silence that followed was suffocating. The bodyguards at the door, two massive men named Grant and Hayes, shifted. The rustle of their tailored suits sounded like thunder as their hands casually dropped to their waistbands. Simone froze. Her heart slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird, and her breath hitched, catching painfully in her throat. She didn't drop to her knees. She didn't weep. A hollow, cynical part of her brain simply calculated how long it would take for her body to be found. She was a black woman with a rap sheet for petty theft and a pile of final notices on her kitchen counter. She wouldn't even make the evening news. "My apologies," Simone said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the trembling reverence people usually offered him. She stared at the pile of ash. Leo slowly lowered the ledger, dark, assessing eyes fixed on her. He didn't look angry. He looked entirely absent, like a man observing an insect on a leaf. "Clean it," he said. The voice was smooth, a quiet baritone that didn't need volume to command a room. Simone crouched. She grabbed the dustpan and the small broom from her cart. Her hands shook, just a fraction, but she locked her jaw. She swept the ash. She picked up the cigar. She didn't look at him, but she could feel the heat of his gaze. It was heavy, scraping against her skin like wool. "You don't shake," Leo observed. Simone paused, the cigar held between two gloved fingers. "I'm shaking right now." "But you aren't begging." She looked up. He was leaning forward, elbows resting on his knees. The harsh lighting caught the sharp angles of his cheekbones and the impeccable tailoring of his suit. "Would it work?" she asked. Leo's lips twitched. Not a smile, but a disruption of his statuesque calm. "No." "Then I won't waste your time." She deposited the cigar into the trash bag, stood up, and smoothed her apron. "I'll fetch a wet towel for your shoes." She turned her back on him. It was a stupid, suicidal thing to do. You didn't turn your back on a man who ordered executions before his morning espresso. But Simone was too tired to care. The adrenaline spike was already fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. When she returned with the damp cloth, Grant moved to intercept her, his massive hand rising. "Let her pass," Leo murmured. Simone knelt beside his chair. She wiped the leather of his shoe. The smell of expensive shoe polish and faint tobacco filled her nose. She could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing. He was so close, she could see the faint, silvery scar running along his jawline, a violent past written on flawless skin. "What is your name?" he asked. "Simone." "You've been working here for 3 weeks, Simone." "Yes." "Most maids quit after 3 days. Most maids don't have my debt," she replied, standing back up. She didn't elaborate. It wasn't his business. She was a ghost in his house, and she preferred to keep it that way. Leo watched her walk back to her cart. For the first time in a decade, someone had looked at him without seeing the myth. She just saw a mess she had to clean up. 3 nights later, the penthouse was a tomb. Simone was wiping down the kitchen counters, the sharp, chemical bite of lemon ammonia stinging the inside of her nose. The digital clock on the oven read 2:14 a.m. She was supposed to leave at midnight, but a late-night meeting had pushed her schedule back. The meeting had involved a lot of shouting from men who didn't work for Leo, followed by a heavy, metallic silence, and finally, the unmistakable sound of something heavy being dragged across the hardwood. Simone had hidden in the pantry. The small room smelled of dried pasta, expensive truffles, and the sharp bite of fear sweating out of her own pores. She had sat on the cool tile floor, clutching a bottle of bleach to her chest like a plastic shield, listening to the muffled thuds. She wasn't a hero. She didn't have a burning desire to peek through the crack in the door and witness the gruesome reality of Leo's business. She just wanted to survive the night. Every heavy thud against the wall sent a vibration through the soles of her shoes. When the front door finally clicked shut, she emerged, grabbed her mop, and actively ignored the faint smear of red near the entryway. Not her business. Just clean. She was wringing out the mop when a shadow fell across the kitchen island. Simone jumped, the mop handle clattering against the plastic bucket. Dirty water splashed onto her cheap sneakers. Leo stood in the doorway. He had shed his jacket. His white dress shirt was unbuttoned at the collar. The sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and intricate, sprawling ink. A dark, ugly bruise was blooming along his left cheekbone, and his knuckles were split and actively bleeding. He didn't look like an untouchable boss right now. He looked like a stray dog that had just won a brutal fight in an alley. The perfect veneer was cracked. Simone stood paralyzed. She had never seen him undone. He walked past her, trailing the faint scent of sweat, copper, and expensive bourbon. He opened the refrigerator, the pale light washing over his battered face, and stared aimlessly into it. "Do you know how to make ice packs?" he asked. His voice was rough, the smooth baritone shredded by whatever shouting he had done an hour ago. Simone swallowed hard. "Just put ice in a towel. Do it." It wasn't a request. Simone left her mop. She moved to the freezer, her cheap rubber soles squeaking against the tile. She grabbed a handful of cubed ice and wrapped it in a clean, thick dishcloth. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a frantic rhythm against her breastbone. She hated this. She hated the intimacy of the late hour, the forced proximity to his bruising face. It blurred the lines. A monster was easier to work for if he never bled. She turned around. Leo had slumped onto one of the bar stools, his head resting heavily in his hands. Simone walked over and extended the makeshift ice pack. He didn't take it. He just tilted his head up, closing his eyes, offering his face to her. Simone froze. A dozen alarm bells screamed in her head. Touching him was crossing a boundary she couldn't afford to cross. Men like him took things. They didn't accept charity. But standing there with a melting towel was just as dangerous. Slowly, hesitantly, she pressed the cold cloth to his cheekbone. Leo flinched. A sharp, hissed breath escaped his teeth. "Sorry," she muttered instinctively, her muscles tensing for a blow. "Don't apologize for things that aren't your fault," he said, his eyes still closed. "It's a bad habit." Simone pressed her lips together. The kitchen was entirely silent except for the low hum of the refrigerator. She stood awkwardly close to him, her arm raised. She noticed the slight tremor in his hands as they rested on the cold granite counter. He was running purely on adrenaline and exhaustion. Up close, he didn't look terrifying. He just looked impossibly tired. "You're bleeding on the floor," Simone pointed out. Her voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. Leo opened his eyes. He looked down at his knuckles, then at the pristine white tiles. "So I am. I just mopped that." It slipped out before she could stop it. A bitter, careless complaint from a woman who had been on her feet for 10 hours. Leo blinked. For a second, Simone thought she had gone too far. Her grip on the ice pack tightened. Then a low, rumbling sound came from his chest. It took her a moment to realize he was laughing. It was a dry, broken sound, but it was real. It echoed strangely in the sterile kitchen. "My apologies, Simone. I'll bleed over the sink next time." She didn't smile. She pulled the ice pack away. "Hold this," she instructed, pressing the cold, wet cloth directly into his palm. She walked over to the sink, wetted a thick paper towel, and brought it back. She grabbed his injured hand. His skin was hot, calloused and rough, a stark contrast to the immaculate suits he wore. Simone ignored the sudden spike of heat that shot up her arm at the contact. She wiped the blood from his knuckles with efficient, unsentimental strokes. She wasn't gentle. She was thorough. As she wiped away the grime, she noticed the faint, white scars crisscrossing his skin. Older battles, older violence. He didn't pull away. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the soft scrape of the paper towel. "Why did you stay?" Leo asked, watching her work. The intensity in his dark eyes was back, pinning her in place. "Grant told everyone to clear out when the guests arrived. If I leave before my shift is done, your accountant docks my pay. I'll tell him not to. I prefer to earn my keep. Favors from men like you aren't free." She tossed the bloody paper towel into the trash can under the counter. "There, you'll live." Leo lowered the ice pack. He looked at her, truly looked at her. He saw the dark bags under her eyes, the rigid, defensive set of her shoulders. The way she kept her weight shifted onto the balls of her feet, ready to bolt. She was tough, but it was a brittle, exhausted kind of toughness. She was entirely out of place in his world of calculated violence, yet she didn't shatter. "You think I'm a monster," he stated. It wasn't a question. Simone met his gaze, her dark eyes flat and unyielding. "I think you're a man who makes a lot of messes, and I'm just the maid." She picked up her mop bucket and walked away. She didn't look back, leaving the undisputed king of the underworld sitting alone in his kitchen, staring at the clean floor, entirely captivated by the woman who refused to fear him. Rainwater pooled in the worn divots of the subway platform, reflecting the flickering, jaundiced light of a dying fluorescent bulb. Simone stared at the oily sheen on the concrete, shivering inside a damp wool coat that smelled faintly of wet dog and the city's endless grime. It was Tuesday. Her brother's latest medical bill was currently folded into a sharp square in her pocket, burning a metaphorical hole through the cheap polyester lining. $4,000. Final notice. She rubbed her right wrist. It throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, keeping time with the distant rumble of the approaching D train. The bruise was blooming into an ugly shade of violet beneath her dark skin. Carter, a low-level debt collector who smelled of stale peppermint gum and cheap gin, had cornered her in the alley behind her apartment building that morning. He hadn't hit her. Men like Carter didn't hit. They gripped. They squeezed bone against nerve to leave a lingering reminder that they were owed. By the time Simone keyed into the private service elevator of the penthouse, her shoulder was stiff and her patience was completely hollowed out. The elevator doors glided open with a soft, expensive chime. Instantly, the sterile, climate-controlled air of the penthouse hit her lungs. It was an offensive contrast to the chaotic, damp world she had just crawled out of. The ozone purifiers hummed. The faint scent of bergamot and imported cedar hung in the air. Leo was sitting at the massive dining table. The surface was a slab of raw edge walnut that cost more than her brother's kidney treatments. He was reviewing a stack of architectural blueprints, a heavy crystal tumbler of amber liquid resting near his elbow. He wore a charcoal dress shirt, the sleeves pushed up to his forearms, revealing the stark, intricate black ink that coiled around his skin. Simone didn't announce herself. She walked straight to the utility closet, grabbed a microfiber cloth and a bottle of glass cleaner, and moved to the floor-to-ceiling windows. She sprayed the glass. The sharp, chemical bite of ammonia cut through the cedar scent. She raised her right arm to wipe the pain, and her breath hissed sharply through her teeth. The movement pulled the bruised muscle in her wrist, sending a hot wire of pain up to her elbow. Her hand faltered, and the cloth squeaked harshly against the glass. Behind her, the rustle of heavy paper stopped. "You're favoring your left side," Leo's voice was low, cutting through the vast, quiet room without any effort. Simone didn't turn around. She switched the cloth to her left hand and continued wiping. "It's nothing. I bumped it on the subway turnstile." The scrape of his chair pushing back sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. Simone's shoulders instantly locked. The soft, measured thud of his footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate against the hardwood floor. "Put the cloth down, Simone." She closed her eyes for a fraction of a second, fighting the urge to tell him to go to hell. She dropped her hand, turning slowly. Leo stopped 2 feet away. Up close, the sheer physical presence of the man was suffocating. He didn't look at her face. His dark, assessing eyes dropped immediately to her right arm. Before she could step back, his hand shot out. He didn't grab her. He simply slid his palm under her wrist, offering a silent, immovable platform. "Sleeve," he demanded quietly. "Mr. Boss," she started, using the cynical nickname she kept entirely inside her head until it accidentally slipped past her lips. She froze, but Leo didn't even blink. "Sleeve." The word was harder this time, vibrating with a quiet authority that didn't leave room for negotiation. With her left hand, Simone awkwardly unbuttoned the cuff of her uniform and shoved the cheap, stiff fabric up to her elbow. The bruise was impossible to hide. It was a vicious, finger-shaped pattern of dark purple and broken blood vessels against her rich brown skin. Leo's jaw clenched. The muscle feathered near his ear. The air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees, turning brittle and cold. He traced the edge of the discoloration with the pad of his thumb. His skin was rough, heavily calloused from years of things he didn't put on a resume, yet his touch was startlingly light. "That is not from a turnstile," he stated. It wasn't a question. "That is a grip mark. Who put their hands on you?" "It's a neighborhood issue. It's handled." Simone tried to pull her arm back, but his thumb pressed slightly, anchoring her. Give me a name. No. Simone met his gaze squarely. Her heart was hammering, but she refused to let her voice shake. You think I want your help? If you handle it, then I owe you. I know how your world works. I'd rather owe the bottom-feeding loan sharks than be in debt to the man who owns the skyline. It was a reckless, stupid thing to say, but she was tired, so deeply, bone-achingly tired. Leo didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He just looked at her, his dark eyes stripping away the defensive layers she wore like armor. He saw the sheer exhaustion, the frayed edges of a woman holding her world together with cheap tape and spite. You think my protection is a transaction, he murmured, his voice dropping to a dangerous, intimate register. Everything in this penthouse is a transaction, she snapped back, finally jerking her arm free. The sudden movement sent a flare of pain through her wrist, but she ignored it. I clean your messes. You pay me. That's the line. Do not cross it. She grabbed her bottle of glass cleaner and walked away. She expected him to fire her. She expected his bodyguards, Grant and Hayes, to escort her to the service elevator. Instead, Leo watched her go, rubbing the calloused pad of his thumb where it had touched her skin. He didn't cross the line. He just decided to erase it entirely. For 2 weeks, the penthouse felt like a pressurized cabin, moments before a blowout. The silence between Simone and Leo was no longer empty. It was heavy, vibrating with an unspoken tension that made the hairs on the back of Simone's neck stand up. He stopped leaving the room when she cleaned. She caught him watching her hands, watching the rigid set of her shoulders, tracking her movements like a predator, figuring out how to approach a trapped, cornered animal without getting bitten. It happened on a Thursday. Simone was in the laundry room, pulling warm, heavy bath towels from the dryer. The room smelled of hot cotton and expensive lavender detergent. It was a comforting, domestic smell that temporarily masked the metallic taint of the city. The first sound wasn't a bang. It was a dull, heavy thwack, like a sledgehammer hitting a melon, followed immediately by the terrifying crystalline crash of the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows failing all at once. The sudden change in air pressure popped Simone's ears. The wind howled through the open breach, carrying the smell of ozone, car exhaust, and the sharp, sulfuric bite of cordite. She dropped the towels. Panic, raw and blinding, seized her chest. She didn't scream. Screaming was for movies. Real fear felt like a cold stone lodged in the throat. She hit the tiled floor, her knees cracking painfully against the hard surface, and crawled into the narrow space between the washing machine and the utility sink. More dull pops echoed in the main living area. Shouting, the heavy thud of bodies hitting the hardwood. Simone curled into a tight ball, squeezing her eyes shut. She pressed her hands over her ears, breathing in short, jagged gasps. The lint on the floor tickled her nose. She squeezed her eyes tighter, waiting for the door to open, waiting for a stray bullet to tear through the drywall. She thought of her brother, sitting in a dialysis chair, wondering why she never came home to make dinner. The laundry room door didn't just open, it was kicked off its hinges. The heavy wood splintered, crashing into the dryer. Simone flinched, bracing for the end. A hand grabbed the back of her uniform collar and hauled her out from behind the machine with terrifying, effortless strength. She thrashed, her elbow flying backward, connecting blindly with solid muscle. "Stop!" The voice was rough, completely stripped of its usual smooth veneer. Simone opened her eyes. Leo was crouched over her. His white shirt was splattered with a horrific arc of crimson across the shoulder. His eyes were wide, completely dilated, reducing the dark irises to thin rings of black. He held a matte black handgun by his hip, his finger resting flat along the slide. He smelled of sweat, burnt gunpowder, and fresh blood. "Are you hit?" he demanded, his hands roaming frantically over her arms, her ribs, checking for wet spots. "No, no, I'm okay," she choked out, her voice trembling violently. "Move." He didn't give her a choice. He grabbed her hand, her bruised right hand, but his grip was fiercely protective, avoiding the tender skin, and dragged her out of the laundry room. The penthouse was a war zone. The expensive walnut table was splintered. The Persian rug was covered in glittering shards of glass and dark, pooling liquid. Cold city air violently whipped through the room, knocking over lamps and scattering paperwork. Leo didn't let her look. He yanked her down a hallway toward his private office, shoving her toward the back wall. He slammed his palm against a hidden panel behind a massive oil painting. The wall hissed, heavy steel grinding against steel, revealing a narrow, pitch-black space. "In," he ordered, shoving her forward. Simone stumbled into the dark. Leo stepped in right behind her, hitting a button. The steel door sealed shut with a heavy, final clunk, plunging them into absolute silence. A second later, dim red emergency lights flickered on, casting brutal, harsh shadows across the tiny panic room. It was no larger than a walk-in closet. The air was instantly stale, heavily filtered, and smelled faintly of copper and old dust. Simone backed up until her spine hit the cold steel wall. The enclosed space hit her violently. The adrenaline was crashing, leaving behind a terrifying, suffocating panic. Her chest heaved. The walls felt like they were shrinking, compressing her ribs. She couldn't breathe. The air felt thick, like sucking oxygen through a wet wool blanket. "Hey," Leo said. He dropped the gun on a small metal shelf. It made a loud, echoing clatter. He stepped directly into her space, crowding her, pinning her between the wall and his body. He didn't try to soothe her with empty words. He knew better. He reached out and framed her face with both hands. His palms were hot, smeared with dirt and someone else's blood. But she didn't care. "Look at me," he commanded. Simone squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head, trying to drag air into her burning lungs. "Simone, look at me." His thumbs pressed into her cheekbones, forcing her head up. She snapped her eyes open. His face was inches from hers in the bloody red light. The perfect, untouchable mob boss was entirely gone. His hair was disheveled, his jaw tight with his own residual adrenaline. But his eyes were entirely focused on her, anchoring her to the ground. "Breathe with me," he said, forcing his own breathing to slow down, making his chest rise and fall in a steady, exaggerated rhythm. She stared into his eyes, matching the rise and fall of his chest. Her hands, trembling uncontrollably, reached up and grabbed his forearms. The bespoke silk of his shirt felt smooth beneath her rough, calloused fingertips. She could feel the hard, coiled muscle underneath, trembling slightly with an emotion she couldn't name. Slowly, the edges of her vision stopped swimming. The suffocating weight in her chest began to loosen. She was breathing. Just breathing. The reality of the situation crashed over her. She was a maid from the Bronx, hiding in a steel box with a syndicate boss who had just killed men in his living room. She should be terrified of him. She should be shrinking away. Instead, she realized she was gripping his arms like a lifeline. Leo didn't pull away. He stepped closer, his body lightly pressing against hers, offering warmth in the freezing room. His thumb moved, slowly wiping a single, traitorous tear from the corner of her eye. The gesture was impossibly gentle, a stark, jarring contradiction to the violence he had just committed. "You aren't just the maid anymore," he murmured. His voice was a low rumble in the tight space. "You know that, right?" Simone swallowed the hard knot in her throat. The cynical, defensive part of her brain screamed at her to push him away, to rebuild the wall. But the wall was gone, shattered right alongside the bulletproof glass. I know, she whispered. Her voice was raw, devoid of its usual sharp edge. Leo's eyes darkened. He dropped his forehead against hers, closing his eyes. It wasn't a kiss. It was something heavier. It was a surrender. In his sterile, perfectly controlled world of violence and ledgers, she was the only real, messy, human thing left. And he knew, with terrifying certainty, that he would burn the entire city to ash before he let anyone touch her again. Did this intense, slow-burn Mafia romance leave you breathless? The line between survival and undeniable attraction has never been so dangerously thin. Simone and Leo's story proves that the most powerful force isn't fear. It's the messy, raw reality of human connection. If you loved this gritty, sensory deep dive into the underworld, smash that like button, share this video with your friends, and hit subscribe for more dark, thrilling stories. Leave a comment below with your favorite specific moment.